Tonight, we're doing something a little different. Dim the lights, get comfortable. Pull your blanket a little tighter. Yes, even if you don't think you're scared of history, you're about to be. Because tonight, we're not talking about kings or castles or plagues or all the fun medieval disasters we normally dive into. Tonight, we're talking about something stranger, something quieter, something that shouldn't exist, and yet it sits right there in the timeline, like a spilled cup of ink that no one wants to clean up. Tonight, we're talking about the centuries that vanished, the years that never left behind a footprint, the centuries that barely happened, or maybe didn't happen at all. Yeah, we're going there. Before we do, like the video if you enjoy your historical mysteries extra dark and extra strange. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into things your school definitely didn't bother explaining. And comment where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's nothing like uncovering a 1,000-year mystery at 3 a.m. Now settle in, breathe slow, get cozy, because tonight we're stepping into the strange, drafty house of history and realizing a few rooms are completely missing. Welcome to the story of how 1,000 years of human history simply disappeared. Good luck. You wake up to a sound that isn't quite a sound, more like a hum, the kind of low vibration that seems to come from the very walls of your room. Or is it the sky? The village outside your window is quiet, but not the kind of quiet that's restful. It's the kind of quiet that makes you suspect something is missing, something essential, a note skipped in the symphony of existence. You roll over, tug the threadbare blanket closer, and blink. The sun hasn't yet fully risen, and the light that filters in through the latticed window casts long, angular shadows. Cobblestones glint wetly in the dawn mist, though you know you didn't hear rain. That's peculiar. Strange. The kind of thing historians, if there were any left to notice, might have scribbled a footnote about. But here, you are, wide awake, in the middle of a village that smells like bread baking, smoke curling from chimneys, and something faintly metallic, like a hinge long unused, rusting slowly in time. You swing your legs over the edge of the bed and notice your shoes are old. Not antique, not deliberately retro, old. The kind of old where the leather has softened into something uncanny, something almost alive. You place them on the floor, and the wood groans as if relieved to bear your weight. You stumble to the window, and the scene outside makes your stomach twist with the tiniest pinch of alarm. The marketplace is arranged in an almost ritualistic order. Stalls are there, but the wares, they don't quite belong. Spices that should be imported from distant lands are next to fruit you know isn't supposed to exist until decades from now. Pots, jars, and trinkets seem familiar and foreign all at once. It's like waking up inside a book where the illustrator changed mid-chapter. And then you notice it, the first hint that something is deeply, irreparably broken. A bell tolls. Or perhaps it doesn't. The church clock in the village square leans at a slant, its hands pointing at 6:12, yet the sun has only just begun to rise. You check your own timekeeping device, an old pocket watch with a face scratched beyond legibility, and it seems to protest, spinning its hands in small, frantic circles, unsure which century it inhabits. It is at this precise moment, as the mist curls and the market begins to stir, that you understand you are not merely in a village. You are in a place where time itself has hiccuped, skipped a beat, or been quietly abducted in the night. You dress slowly, noting the textures of your garments. The tunic is soft, yes, but the stitching, the way the seams are knotted, it's not quite right. The tailor who supposedly made this either didn't exist or has a memory lost to the ages. Your fingers trace the embroidery along the cuffs, and you feel a shiver. You wonder, for the first time, if history is reliable at all. The streets are alive with villagers, and yet their conversations make no sense. A woman haggles over onions, but her words are peppered with anachronisms. She speaks of a harvest next century as if it were tomorrow. Children chase each other, their laughter echoing across time zones that should not overlap. A blacksmith pounds a bell, but the rhythm is wrong, offbeat, almost musical in its impossibility. And you notice something else. There is a striking absence of records. No posters, no town notices, no official decrees. Even the church seems reticent, its wooden doors shut tightly against scrutiny. You wander to the village square, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and unease. A fountain gurgles in the center, but the stone is fresh, newly carved, as if someone had decided that centuries of wear would not be tolerated. You cup your hands to drink, and the water tastes faintly metallic, as if it remembers events you do not. A goose waddles past, pecking at a coin. You pick it up. You don't recognize the monarch's face, nor the date. It reads 923, or is it 1723, or 1023? You try to make sense of it, and your brain hiccups in protest. The inn nearby offers a smell of fresh bread and burning wood, yet no one greets you. The door swings open, revealing a scene frozen in indecision. A hearth roaring, a maid arranging mugs, a patron reading a ledger. And yet, the ledger itself is empty. Only blank pages. Ink stains that suggest hurried work, but the names and dates vanished. You ask a question. The words come out, but the villagers' responses seem rehearsed, almost hesitant. They tell you the date is today. Yes, today. And the year? They glance at each other nervously. It is 1024, says one. Another mutters, or 1324. And somewhere in the corner, a dog yawns, completely unconcerned. This is when the thought hits you. History has gone missing. Not just fragments, but whole volumes, entire centuries. As if some cosmic librarian had decided that 1,000 years were too cumbersome, too inconvenient, or too embarrassing to retain. You feel the absurdity of it, the human need for order against the universe's delightful chaos. You wander further, drawn by the strange sensation of déjà vu that isn't quite memory. A scribe, hunched over a table in the shadowed corner of the town hall, scribbles numbers and names that don't match. He pauses, looks up at you, then quickly erases a line, muttering about keeping things tidy. You squint at the parchment. An emperor's coronation dated 1025. Yet another source nearby says 1425. A millennium trapped in a single moment. By now, the sun has climbed higher, and the village hums with a rhythm you cannot name. Merchants shout, children play, and the town crier bellows announcements you cannot parse. You realize that everywhere you look, there are gaps. Calendars, ledgers, the very fabric of social memory, ripped and rewoven without explanation. You begin to notice other artifacts. A sword lying abandoned near the fountain, polished and ornate, yet unlike any design you've seen in textbooks. A book, its cover leather and cracked, rests on a bench, but the language shifts as you read it, sentences folding in on themselves, flipping from Latin to Old Norse to a dialect you can't place. And here, in the thickening light, you feel it. The world is slightly tilted, off kilter, and you are the only one awake enough to notice. You are the sole witness to centuries that have been quietly stolen. The realization is at once exhilarating and terrifying. Every familiar reference, the rise of empires, the spread of religion, the slow crawl of technology, is suddenly questionable. You realize you cannot trust the chronologies you learned in school. You cannot trust any of the milestones you once held sacred. You pause at the fountain, letting the murmuring water wash over your unease. You consider the people around you. Are they aware? Or are they actors in some cosmic play, oblivious to the missing stage directions? And if time itself has holes, what else has vanished? What knowledge, what inventions, what entire ways of thinking were quietly erased, perhaps for reasons we may never know? You decide, after some hesitation, to start looking, to notice the inconsistencies, to ask the impossible questions. What year is it, really? Who ruled, and who was invented? Which battles, which plagues, which triumphs are genuine, and which are clever fictions to make sense of chaos? And as you take your first step into this investigation, the world seems to lean in, waiting for you to notice. Because here is the truth you cannot ignore. Time is broken, and you are its reluctant observer. You feel a shiver run down your spine, not entirely unpleasant. Curiosity flickers alongside fear. You know, deep down, that nothing will ever be the same again. The comfort of a linear timeline is gone. The neat rows of years, neatly tucked into books and maps, have been upended. And in that very unmooring, something extraordinary awaits. The chance to explore the gaps, the missing chapters, the ghost centuries no one ever talks about. So you take a deep breath, grip your tunic, and step out fully into the village. Every sound, every smell, every misplaced coin is a clue. Every glance from a villager, every hesitation, every nonsensical date is a breadcrumb. You begin to assemble your mental map of a world slightly askew, a world in which 1,000 years could vanish, and no one, even the experts, would be the wiser. And in this world, you are awake. The morning air still smells faintly of burnt wood and wet cobblestones as you leave the village square. You think you might have spotted a clue or two, but then the thought strikes, what if the clues themselves are unreliable? What if every piece of evidence you've been taught to trust, books, chronicles, even your own memory, is lying to you? You follow a narrow street that winds between timber-framed houses, the kind that lean slightly, as if tired of holding themselves upright. At the end of the lane, tucked behind an overgrown hedge, you find it, a monastery. Dust motes dance in shafts of light that pierce the stained glass windows, and a bell tolls somewhere deep within. Inside, the air smells of parchment, ink, and an unidentifiable mildew that speaks of centuries forgotten. You step cautiously into the scriptorium, the heart of this monastery where knowledge is preserved, or so you think. Rows of wooden tables stretch into shadow, each occupied by a monk bent over his work. Quills scratch furiously, but the scribe's movements are frantic, almost panicked. One monk looks up at you, squints, and mutters something in Latin. You can't understand him, but you sense the urgency. They are desperate to hold time together, one page at a time. You walk past piles of manuscripts stacked high like towers teetering under the weight of centuries. Each book is unique, yet strangely familiar. Illuminated letters curl like ivy, dates are written meticulously, yet they don't match anything you've ever learned. A history of kings shows one monarch reigning for 25 years. Yet in another manuscript, the same king appears 40 years later, still alive, still ruling. The discrepancies make your head swim. A monk fumbles with a sheaf of pages, muttering, "If only the previous scribe hadn't been so imaginative." He looks up at you, eyes wide. "Imaginative," he says again, shaking his head as he rewrites a date for what feels like the 100th time that morning. The room is filled with a quiet, desperate energy. You realize these monks are not merely copying history. They are wrestling with it, trying to force it to make sense. You pause by a manuscript showing the coronation of a supposed emperor. The date reads 1023. Flip a page, and you find 1423. A footnote claims he married a queen who didn't exist, then corrects itself in the next line, blaming a clerical error. You laugh quietly. It's absurd, almost charming, the way someone could erase a queen simply because she didn't fit the timeline. And yet, the laughter is tinged with unease. How much of what you know about history is equally unreliable? You notice a group of monks clustered around a map. Their fingers trace lines that don't correspond to any known geography. Rivers appear in places where none exist. Towns pop up and vanish like magic tricks. One monk taps a quill against the table and sighs. "We are inventing the past," he mutters, "because the past refuses to cooperate." He gives you a look as if daring you to challenge him. You don't. You simply nod and secretly wonder if he is right. A bell tolls again. The sound reverberates through the stone walls, a constant reminder of time's insistence. And yet, even as the bells chime, you notice the contradictions piling up. A chronicle lists 3 different popes reigning simultaneously. Another manuscript describes a war that supposedly lasted 5 years, but archaeological notes indicate it happened over a mere 5 months. You try to reconcile it all in your head, but the pieces refuse to fit. Time is bending around itself, and these monks are its contortionists. Humor creeps in. One monk drops a stack of papers, and they scatter across the floor. He groans, muttering about the inefficiency of history itself. Another monk chimes in, "If history were easy, we'd all be out of work." You can't help but smile. Even in the midst of confusion, they have retained the dry wit of people who know the absurdity of their task. You wander further into the scriptorium, stopping by a table covered in books so fragile that touching them seems sacrilegious. You peer at the pages. The scripts shift mid-sentence from Latin to Greek, then to an unfamiliar dialect that makes your brain hurt. Marginalia, scribbles by long-dead scholars, argue with the main text, correcting, contradicting, and sometimes insulting the author. A note reads, "He clearly had no idea what year it was, or century, or millennium." You chuckle quietly. The scribes are sarcastic, judgmental, alive in a way you didn't expect. Then, you notice a curious pattern. Many of the manuscripts seem to avoid certain periods entirely. Pages have been removed, burned, or never recorded. These are the eras with suspiciously few receipts, the centuries where documentation is scant, inconsistent, or outright missing. You realize history is not continuous, it is patchwork. Whole swaths of human experience are stitched together with guesswork, conjecture, and sometimes convenient lies. You approach an older monk whose eyes gleam with a mixture of fatigue and mischief. "Why are there gaps?" you ask. He cocks his head. "Gaps?" he repeats. "We call them breathing spaces. The past needs room to stretch." He winks. You don't know if he is joking. Perhaps he is. Or perhaps he knows more than he is letting on. Another scribe leans over, whispering urgently, "Some of these dates, some of these kings, they never existed. We put them there because, well, it made the math work." You blink. Math? You realize he means chronology itself. If you try to align every event in a neat, linear fashion, the numbers don't add up. Some years simply didn't happen. And yet, to maintain coherence, to preserve the illusion of history, people invented rulers, battles, and treaties. You watch as a monk scrapes ink across a page, erasing an entire lineage of nobility. "Better this than admitting we have no idea," he says. You shiver. History is not just lying, it is actively being rewritten, sometimes with intent, sometimes out of desperation. The humor and horror intermingle. You laugh softly as you watch a monk argue with a colleague over whether a king's reign was 12 or 22 years. Yet a tiny part of you quivers. This is not just academic. This is reality itself bending under the weight of human desire to order chaos. A timeline, after all, is only as truthful as the people who keep it, and clearly, they are flawed. You wander toward a window and peer outside. The village carries on, oblivious. Life seems ordinary. But the scriptorium has revealed the truth. History is unreliable. Even the most authoritative sources, the books you grew up trusting, the dates memorized for exams, the celebrated events in every classroom, are riddled with omissions, alterations, and outright fabrications. A crow lands on the sill, cocking its head as if it knows what you now understand. You follow its gaze and notice the stone monument in the village square. The inscription is smudged, the dates barely legible. You can make out fragments of names, but the years, missing. The monument itself is a metaphor, you think, a stone embodiment of time's caprice, a reminder that what we see is never the whole story. Returning to the scriptorium, you notice a particularly intriguing manuscript. It details the life of a king who supposedly conquered half of Europe, yet no other sources corroborate his existence. The descriptions are lavish, poetic, almost cinematic. Battles fought with precision, alliances forged and broken, treaties signed and forgotten. And yet, the footnotes confess, no evidence survives. Perhaps he was a dream, perhaps necessary fiction. You sit at a table, scribbling your own notes. You try to map events, to line up reigns and wars, yet the contradictions pile up like fallen bricks. You realize, with a sense of dawning awe, that this is not failure. It is not incompetence. It is the nature of history itself. History is a narrative crafted from fragments, each storyteller bending reality just enough to make sense of chaos. Hours pass. Sunlight shifts across the scriptorium floor, illuminating dust and manuscripts alike. You realize that these monks, these overworked, anxious, sarcastic scribes, are guardians of a fragile truth, that the past is messy, uncertain, and infinitely more fascinating for its gaps. They wrestle with centuries that may never be recovered, attempting to force sense onto nonsense, humor onto tragedy, and meaning onto absence. And here you sit, in their midst, wide-eyed and attentive, beginning to understand that history books do not lie by accident. They lie because the truth is impossible to contain. Every erased page, every altered date, every invented king is part of the grand performance that allows the rest of the world to believe in continuity, in progress, in order. Without it, well, nothing would make sense at all. A bell tolls again. You look around. The monks resume their labor, scribbling, erasing, muttering, and arguing. Outside, the village carries on, oblivious. And yet, inside this monastery, in the faint scent of ink and dust, you grasp the profound, dizzying, exhilarating truth. Time has holes, and human hands, no matter how meticulous, cannot mend them entirely. You rise, stretching, and prepare to leave. There is much more to see, much more to explore. You have only begun to scratch the surface. Somewhere out there, beyond this scriptorium, the phantom centuries await. The gaps, the missing kings, the blank pages, the contradictions, they are waiting for you to notice, to question, to investigate. And now you are ready. The morning you spent among the monks lingers like an echo in your mind. Their frantic scratching, whispered arguments, and carefully inked erasures have left a mark. You now understand that history is less a river and more a puzzle missing entire pieces. But as you leave the scriptorium, stepping back into the village streets, a more unsettling thought takes root. These aren't just small omissions or clerical errors. Some centuries, entire, vast centuries, might never have existed at all. Or perhaps, even stranger, they were invented. You wander toward the edge of town, past the fountain where water gurbles like a bemused bystander to centuries lost, and toward the rolling hills beyond. Here, the countryside stretches like a tapestry, stitched together in a way that feels both familiar and absurdly wrong. Farms are organized, but the tools used are a curious mix of eras. You spot a farmer wielding a plow that seems centuries too advanced for the crops growing before him. Meanwhile, a shepherd tends goats with a staff so worn it might have belonged to someone long dead, or perhaps never alive at all. You pause to examine a weathered stone marker by the road. Its inscription is nearly illegible, but fragments of numbers peek through. 614, 915, 1023. Each date jumps unpredictably, no sequence, no pattern. A bird flits across the stone, seemingly unconcerned by the chaos, reminding you that nature continues regardless of human attempts at order. The marker itself might be ancient or entirely fabricated. You cannot tell. As you continue walking, you encounter a curious sight. A small camp of travelers, tents pitched in a clearing. One of them is reading aloud from a scroll, reciting events that should, by all logic, have occurred hundreds of years apart. Kings are crowned in the same breath as future conquests. A war is said to end before it began. You listen, captivated and disoriented. The storyteller's tone is casual, almost bored, as if recounting impossible events as part of an ordinary day. And maybe it is. You realize, with a jolt, that the gaps in time are not merely absences. They are active spaces where reality wobbles, where human perception struggles to catch up. This is the domain of the phantom time hypothesis, the theory that entire centuries, some claim from 614 to 911, simply didn't happen. Some rulers never reigned, some events never occurred, and yet our history books present them as facts. The audacity of it is staggering. And the humor, if dark, is irresistible. Imagine discovering that the reign of an emperor you memorized in school was a fabrication, or that a war you thought was pivotal never happened. You step into a small village that seems to have emerged from nowhere. Its architecture is a curious mix of early Gothic and late Renaissance styles, a mishmash that makes your brain itch. You enter the tavern, hoping to ask questions, but the innkeeper just smiles and pours you a cup of watered wine. It's a fine day in the year, well, whichever one you prefer, he says. You frown. Every conversation, every reference, every casual mention of a date is as slippery as smoke. And the locals speak of events and rulers you cannot verify. You start to wonder, if an entire civilization had been erased, would anyone notice? A map on the wall catches your eye. It depicts Europe, with territories shifting unpredictably, borders appearing and disappearing with no apparent rhyme or reason. A king rules over lands that seem to blink in and out of existence. Rivers curve strangely, as if drawn by a hand unsure of geography. The innkeeper notices your fascination. "Ah, yes," he says, leaning on the counter. "History is flexible here. Sometimes it bends. Sometimes it vanishes entirely." You sit by the hearth, contemplating the stories. Emperors who never existed, wars that were invented to justify power, entire dynasties fabricated to fill the silence between real events. And yet, even in the midst of this absurdity, life continues. Farmers plant crops, children play, the wind carries the scent of smoke and bread. The world moves forward, even if the centuries themselves are missing. You leave the tavern, the evening sun casting long shadows across the uneven streets. The thought that keeps gnawing at you is simple, terrifying, and exhilarating. What other facts of history might be inventions? You see the ruins of an old castle atop a hill. Its walls are crumbling, but the stone itself seems to hum with stories untold. Perhaps it was built in a century that never existed. Perhaps the battles fought there were imagined. You cannot know. The night deepens, and you find yourself wandering through a forest on the outskirts of the village. The trees sway gently in a wind that seems to whisper names and dates that you recognize and yet cannot place. You stumble upon a clearing where the remains of an ancient amphitheater lie half buried. The inscriptions on the stones are worn, but fragments hint at performances, debates, and public gatherings that might or might not have occurred. The air is thick with the scent of moss and mystery. You sit on a fallen column, tracing the grooves of carved letters. A question forms in your mind. If entire centuries were fabricated, what purpose would that serve? Power, yes. Control, certainly. But also, perhaps, convenience. The past is messy. Human memory is unreliable. By inventing rulers and wars, by deleting inconvenient events, societies could create a coherent narrative where none naturally existed, and we, the inheritors of these tales, accept them without question. Your musings are interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A figure approaches, a scholar, wandering the same forest, carrying a bundle of scrolls and manuscripts. He greets you with a wry smile. "Ah, another seeker," he says. "You've noticed the gaps, I presume?" You nod. "Yes. Some centuries? Vanished." He chuckles. "Vanished, invented, lost in translation, burned by accident. Take your pick. The past is a fluid thing." He spreads his scrolls on the ground, revealing timelines that twist and knot like ribbons in a breeze. One shows a king reigning twice over centuries apart. Another records a plague that seems to hop across regions before it spreads. You realize that the scholar is not merely observing history, he is curating its inconsistencies, cataloging its oddities, preserving the evidence of absence. You ask him why this has happened. He shrugs. Humans are storytellers first, and record keepers second. Sometimes the story is more important than the facts. Sometimes we need 1,000 years that never existed to make sense of the ones we do have. His eyes twinkle with mischief and melancholy. Or perhaps we need them because reality itself was inconvenient. History must be tidy, neat, linear, and the universe never cooperates. You leave the forest as darkness settles in. The village lights flicker in the distance, welcoming and strange. You realize that the vanished centuries are not just curiosities, they are warnings. They remind you that history is malleable, that timelines are fragile, and that human understanding of the past is always incomplete. The more you investigate, the more you see the holes, the cracks, the ghostly absences. Returning to the village, you pass familiar streets that suddenly feel unfamiliar. Every building, every artifact, every monument carries the weight of possibility. What you thought you knew about kings, queens, wars, and inventions might be entirely false. And yet, there is beauty in the uncertainty. The gaps, the invented rulers, the phantom battles, they invite you to question, to explore, to imagine. As you settle for the night in a small inn, the candlelight flickering across your table, you reflect on what you've learned. The centuries that vanished or were invented are more than historical oddities. They are mirrors, showing you how fragile memory is, how selective record-keeping can be, and how deeply humans desire order in chaos. The fire crackles. Outside, the wind whispers across rooftops. Somewhere, in the distance, a bell tolls. You drift into uneasy sleep, dreaming of emperors who never lived, battles that never occurred, and a world in which the past is a malleable, mysterious, and often mischievous thing. Because the truth, you realize as consciousness fades, is this. The centuries may have vanished, but their absence speaks louder than any inscription ever could. And you are awake enough to hear it. The dawn of this chapter is not quiet. It is gilded, perfumed, and far too conscious of its own importance. You find yourself approaching a palace perched atop a hill, the kind of imposing fortress that seems to sneer at the village below. Its walls are polished, towers scraping the clouds, banners fluttering with the symbols of rulers who may, or may not, have ever existed. You feel a shiver of anticipation, because here, in these halls, The missing centuries were not lost by accident. They were sculpted, carefully, like a tailor hemming a garment to make it fit. As you step through the massive oak doors, a rush of warmth hits you, scented with burning wood, incense, and a faint trace of paranoia. Courtiers bustle about, their gowns swishing, their faces carefully blank in that practiced way of those who know too much and reveal too little. They glance at one another with subtle signals, a raised brow, a slight nod. You are immediately aware that erasing history is lucrative, and someone always benefits. In the main hall, a king sits upon his throne, surveying his court with an air of mild amusement. He is handsome, regal, and entirely fictional, or perhaps half-fictional. The records you glimpsed in the scriptorium suggest he should have been born centuries later, yet here he is, alive and inconveniencing reality. Courtiers murmur about his accomplishments, battles he never fought, treaties he never signed, alliances that never happened, and he nods, perfectly at ease with it. To him, time is a malleable substance, needed to suit vanity and ambition. Nearby, a queen, her hair meticulously coiffed, her gowns studded with impossible gems, discusses lineage with a priest. They whisper about ancestors who were conveniently born or erased to smooth over awkward gaps. You notice a pattern. Every erased century benefits someone, whether by justifying a conquest, bolstering a claim to the throne, or quietly erasing rivals who didn't fit the narrative. The absurdity is almost comical, yet beneath the humor is a faint unease. You slip closer to overhear the discussion. A court historian, a thin, nervous man, fumbles with a ledger, erasing and rewriting events to match the king's preferred timeline. No, the siege happened 3 years earlier, he insists. Yes, 3 years earlier. I'll adjust the coronations too. And, perhaps the bishop's influence should be exaggerated. His hands shake as he corrects history, ink smudging across parchment. One slip, and the story collapses like a poorly stacked deck of cards. A jester strolls by, balancing a tray of fruit, and leans in conspiratorially. Imagine deleting 3 centuries, he says, juggling a pear. 3 entire centuries, and no one is the wiser. Makes you wonder why anyone bothers with history at all, doesn't it? He laughs, and the courtiers laugh with him, though their laughter has an edge. One cannot admit to knowing too much in a place where fiction is currency. The king calls for silence. A meeting of the council begins. Maps are unfurled, showing territories that shift like mirages. Battles are recounted, victories inflated, defeats quietly erased. A general argues for acknowledging a skirmish that inconveniently proves a rival's claim. The king waves him away. Better it never happened, he says with a sigh, than for it to confuse the people. You note the casual cruelty of it. Erasing history is not merely about hiding mistakes. It is about shaping perception, controlling memory, and preserving power. In a quieter corridor, you glimpse scribes working feverishly, comparing accounts from distant lands, adjusting dates, inventing letters, and crafting genealogies that smooth over inconvenient gaps. One scribe whispers to another, "If we can just invent a few kings here, shift a couple of wars there, the chronology will be perfect. The people will never know." They smile nervously, aware that perfection in this context is an illusion. Their work is both meticulous and absurd, a comedy of errors dressed as governance. The court's influence stretches far beyond the palace walls. Letters dispatched to neighboring rulers subtly rewrite treaties, erase alliances, and correct dates. You imagine scribes across continents performing the same delicate dance, ink on parchment, erasing reality one stroke at a time. Wars are justified posthumously, genealogies rewritten, and entire events either exaggerated or suppressed, all to serve the whims of the powerful. In a grand library, you notice scrolls labeled with the names of emperors who may never have drawn breath. One scroll recounts the triumphs of a king who supposedly ruled for 70 years, yet archaeological evidence suggests he could not have existed. The librarians tend these records with reverence, aware of their artifice, knowing the weight of the stories they propagate. The air is heavy with the smell of ink and secrecy. Every scroll is a patch, every manuscript a stitch, keeping together a tapestry riddled with holes. Humor surfaces again, oddly comforting in the midst of this deception. A court chronicler mutters, "If anyone discovers the truth, we'll simply blame it on a plague, a fire, or a drunk monk. It works every time." You smile despite yourself. There is brilliance in this absurdity. The deliberate, chaotic artistry of rewriting the past to serve present ambitions. You wander into the gardens where statues of long-forgotten figures glint in the sunlight. Some are historical, some purely fictional, sculpted to fill in gaps where reality is missing. The gardener tends the roses with meticulous care, unaware, or perhaps perfectly aware, of the phantom kings and invented queens immortalized in stone. Even in beauty, history's lies are visible. The landscape itself has been molded to accommodate absence. You pause by a fountain. Water spills over the edges, cascading rhythmically, as if mocking the human desire for order. You watch your reflection ripple in its surface, a distorted image in a world of invented timelines. And then it strikes you. Those who benefit from erasing history do not merely enjoy power. They are architects of perception. They determine who is remembered and who is forgotten. They control narratives, manipulate collective memory, and craft the world in their image. Even humor has a purpose here. The court jester's jabs, the scribe's sarcastic marginalia, the playful exaggerations of triumphs, they all serve to disguise the truth. History is a tool wielded by those who understand its absence better than its content. Each omission, each invention, each carefully placed gap consolidates authority. As evening falls, the palace glows in a golden haze. Candlelight flickers across walls adorned with tapestries depicting victories that never occurred, celebrations that never happened, and rulers who may only exist in ink and imagination. Courtiers laugh at jokes about kings who vanished, battles erased, and entire centuries made invisible. You realize that in this strange theater of human ambition, humor is both shield and weapon, a way to cope with the impossible, a way to soften the edges of absurdity, a way to charm the story into existence. You leave the palace as twilight deepens. The village below, unaware of the royal machinations, continues its daily rhythms. The fountain bubbles, children chase one another, and smoke curls from chimneys. Yet, somewhere in the palace above, History is being carefully tailored. Gaps are being filled or ignored, and perception is being guided with the precision of a master artist. Walking back through the streets, you understand a crucial truth. The vanished centuries are not random. They have beneficiaries. Kings, queens, emperors, and scribes alike have a stake in the absence of truth. They are both villains and visionaries, shaping not just the past, but the way future generations will perceive it. And now, as an observer, you are part of this delicate, chaotic narrative. At night, as stars prick the velvet sky, you think of the power wielded by those who control the gaps. You think of phantom kings, invented battles, and centuries rewritten with ink, fire, and deliberate intent. And beneath the humor, beneath the elegance of their schemes, you feel a shiver. History is not merely recorded, it is curated, edited, and sometimes invented entirely by those who stand to gain from its disappearance. The wind carries the scent of burning candles and parchment, a reminder that the past is fragile and the present is mischievous. Somewhere in the shadows of the palace, scribes continue their work. The jester's laughter echoes faintly, a reminder that even in absurdity, truth is negotiable. You walk toward your lodgings, mind buzzing with the enormity of it all. Because now you know, the people who erased history did not do so out of malice alone. They did it to craft a world that suited them, a world where gaps could be filled with fiction, absence could be profitable, and perception was everything. And you, wandering through the remnants of reality, are awake enough to see it. You awake to a village that is, at first glance, ordinary. The sun peeks over the horizon, glinting off dew-laden cobblestones. Birds chirp, smoke curls from chimneys. Life goes on. And yet, from the moment you step into the square, it hits you. Something is terribly, laughably wrong. Town criers shout from balconies, ringing bells with frantic vigor. Year 1024! Year 11324! Year 1023 again! Each proclamation overlaps the other, creating a cacophony of conflicting dates. A woman haggles over cheese with a merchant who insists it is 1224. Children chase one another through the square, laughing as though the chaos of calendars is merely a game. Meanwhile, a priest steps onto a platform, clutching a tattered scroll, announcing a feast day that supposedly belongs to the year 1424. You clutch your head. Everywhere you look, the years contradict each other. You realize that in this world, time is not a straight line. It is a tangled knot, a Mobius strip, a loaf of bread with slices missing and others mysteriously doubled. You wander through the streets, trying to reconcile the contradictions. A butcher sweeps his shop, muttering about preparing for a festival that technically belongs to next century. Across the way, a baker sets out loaves stamped with dates that don't match the ones on the calendar above the door. You try to ask someone what year it is, and they answer cautiously. Depends on which priest you trust. You chuckle, but it is the kind of laughter that trembles along the edge of hysteria. At the heart of the square, a gathering forms. Townsfolk argue over when planting season should begin. Farmers hold charts, scribbled notes, and almanacs in their hands. Some swear by the lunar calendar. Others insist on the solar reckoning. And a few eccentric elders mutter about the old ways, gesturing to celestial alignments that no one seems to remember how to interpret. The result is total temporal chaos. People plant crops, celebrate feasts, and pay taxes according to wildly different years, yet the village somehow survives. Somehow. You find yourself drawn to a small church at the edge of the square. Inside, candles flicker, illuminating priests hunched over ledgers. They whisper urgently, trying to reconcile ecclesiastical years with local customs. Some have already thrown their hands in the air, muttering, "If it doesn't fit, just change it." Marginalia on their parchments reflect the frustration, dates scribbled, crossed out, rewritten, and sometimes erased entirely. One note reads, "Better to anger God than admit we have no idea." Outside, a bell tower rings intermittently. Its schedule makes no sense. Twice it tolls for noon, then again for the start of a feast day, and once for a festival that supposedly occurred decades ago. You watch as villagers look up, tilting their heads in confusion, trying to sync their watches, or more accurately, their memories, to a clock that is itself confused. A child tugs at your sleeve. "What year is it?" she asks. You hesitate. You know the correct answer is unknowable. You point vaguely at the square and say, "It's whatever the town decides it is today." She giggles, satisfied. Perhaps understanding the absurdity is enough. As you walk further, you notice a group of merchants arguing over contracts. One insists that a shipment is due in 1324, while another claims the same delivery should have arrived in 1024. Ink-stained ledgers are waved in the air like banners of protest. A scribe tries desperately to reconcile the discrepancies, muttering under his breath, "Calendars. Every century has its own madness." You feel for him, but also marvel at the ingenuity required to maintain commerce amidst temporal anarchy. Humor, inevitably, creeps in. A man, wearing a tall hat and carrying a bag of coins, declares, "I shall pay my taxes in the year I prefer." Laughter erupts, followed by confused muttering from town officials. One of them sighs, "If only God would pick a year and stick to it." The absurdity is staggering, yet oddly charming. People continue their lives, despite the jumble of overlapping years, lost months, and phantom centuries. You wander into the marketplace, where festivals collide. A May Day celebration, supposedly long over, merges with a harvest festival that hasn't happened yet. Children dance around a maypole while adults carry pumpkins for a feast that belongs to the next century. Somewhere, a minstrel sings a ballad referencing a war that never occurred. You laugh quietly, realizing that the medieval calendar crisis is not merely a clerical error. It is a cultural symphony of chaos, improvisation, and survival. In a quieter corner, you spot an elderly astronomer, hunched over charts of stars. He mutters about discrepancies in equinoxes, lunar cycles, and planetary alignments. 3 calendars overlap, he says, eyes wide. You might be born in year X and die in year X, but live twice the number of years in between. You blink. You realize he is serious. Time is not linear here. It is a patchwork quilt, stitched with mistakes, superstition, and human ingenuity. You continue wandering, noting the bizarre overlaps. Bells ring at midnight for festivals yet to occur. Monks chant prayers for years that never existed. Merchants stamp contracts with impossible dates. Children celebrate birthdays that may belong to another century entirely. And through it all, villagers shrug, adapt, and carry on. Life persists, even when time itself is fractured. In a tavern, you overhear a debate about the correct year for a royal coronation. One patron insists it happened in 1023. Another claims 1323. A third, louder, more insistent, argues for 1423. The innkeeper interrupts, pouring ale. Does it matter? The king is dead. The feast is tonight. Drink. The laughter that follows carries an undercurrent of resilience. Even amid chaos, humor and pragmatism flourish. By evening, you find yourself back at the fountain, watching reflections ripple across the water. The sky deepens to indigo. Stars begin to emerge, their constellations the only constants in a world where years shift like sand. You realize the medieval calendar crisis is not merely confusion over dates. It is a vivid illustration of how fragile human attempts to control time can be. How easily systems collapse. How humor, ingenuity, and sheer stubbornness keep life going when everything else falters. You sit on the fountain edge, considering the lessons of the day. Time is not uniform. Calendars, contracts, festivals, they are human inventions, prone to error, misinterpretation, and creative revision. Entire centuries might be missing, and yet the world continues, as resilient and absurd as ever. History, you realize, is a performance, and the calendar is the script everyone pretends to follow. The wind rustles through the trees. Bells toll inconsistently. A dog barks at the wrong hour. Children play, merchants argue, priests mutter prayers, and scholars scribble frantic corrections. You laugh softly, a mix of amusement and awe. There is beauty in the chaos, poetry in the confusion. Time, fractured though it may be, is alive. As night settles, the village quiets. Sort of. Lanterns glow along the streets, highlighting the crooked cobblestones and leaning buildings. You understand something profound. The medieval calendar crisis is not just about misaligned dates. It is a testament to human adaptability, humor, and resilience in the face of a world that refuses to be neatly ordered. You stand, stretching, feeling the strange exhilaration of having witnessed it. The sun will rise again tomorrow, and the town will continue its dance of overlapping years and phantom centuries. But you, having seen the inconsistencies, the improvisations, and the resilience, are awake enough to understand the profound absurdity of it all. And you will never see a calendar the same way again. The morning is cool, carrying the scent of earth and rain-soaked stone. You leave the familiar streets of the village behind and venture toward landscapes that feel older, quieter, and tinged with mystery. Rolling hills give way to valleys cradling ruins, remnants of civilizations whose stories were never fully told or were deliberately forgotten. Here, the air hums with absence, a weight you can almost touch. You arrive at a sprawling ruin, the skeletal remains of a city, walls toppled, streets cracked, columns strewn like fallen teeth. No map mentions this place. No manuscript carefully documents its history. You wander through the echoing streets, brushing dust from stone steps, imagining the bustle that once filled this space. Merchants shouted prices, children chased dogs through alleyways, priests called the faithful to prayer, and now nothing remains but silence. Carvings on the stones hint at achievements lost to time, intricate geometric patterns, depictions of ceremonies, warriors in strange, unfamiliar attire. You run your fingers over a bas relief of a ruler whose name no one recorded. You realize that this civilization had a story. yet the pages of it were never written or were erased, leaving only fragments. Nearby, a half-collapsed amphitheater hints at performances that delighted audiences centuries ago. The seats are crumbling, yet the acoustics remain hauntingly precise. You imagine actors reciting epic tales, musicians strumming lyres, poets capturing the ethos of a people now vanished from memory. The thought chills you. All this artistry, all this culture has disappeared from the world's consciousness. You come across a library, its roof long gone, shelves toppled, scrolls reduced to brittle fragments. Mice scuttle across the remains of manuscripts, fungi bloom where ink once dried. A scholar might weep at the sight, but you understand a deeper truth. Destruction alone cannot fully erase a civilization, yet it can obscure it enough that memory falters. As you wander further, you notice the peculiar arrangement of the streets. Some alleys curve with mathematical precision, others wind randomly, as if the planners had an entirely different sense of geometry than you are accustomed to. Signs of trade with distant lands remain. Pottery shards, tools fashioned from metals sourced hundreds of miles away. Someone once crossed oceans to bring knowledge here, only for it to vanish again. You pause by a sunken temple, its once grand steps overgrown with weeds. Inside, carvings depict deities unknown to surviving pantheons, rituals whose meaning is lost, and offerings that crumble beneath your touch. A faint wind carries the echo of prayers long silenced. You feel an odd intimacy with these vanished people, as if, for a brief moment, the past is breathing through the ruins. Humor, inevitably, creeps into your observations. You spot a toppled statue of a ruler, one eyebrow arched in what seems like eternal skepticism. Someone, or some forgotten artist, tried to immortalize authority, yet time has flattened it into absurdity. You laugh softly, imagining the pompous monarch reduced to rubble, staring forever at the sky in mock astonishment. You follow a dry riverbed that once carried trade and life into the city. Stones smoothed by water bear faint inscriptions, numbers, names, symbols that resist translation. Archaeologists would later stumble upon these markings and scratch their heads, debating interpretations, correcting each other, sometimes fabricating plausible meanings. You realize even the attempts to recover lost civilizations are shaped by guesswork, imagination, and bias. Suddenly, you notice a cluster of small dwellings, almost entirely swallowed by earth. Doorways gape open like mouths, inviting, yet ominous. Inside, traces of daily life remain. Broken pots, hearths cold for centuries, charred remnants of fires that once cooked meals. Children's toys, tiny carved animals, lie in the dirt, reminders that real people lived, laughed, and loved here, their stories now largely unknown. You feel a pang. History is not only about rulers and wars, it is about the ordinary, who vanish first and are remembered least. You climb a hill overlooking the city. From this vantage, the scale of loss hits you. Streets, plazas, temples, and palaces stretch across the valley, yet no name survives to describe them. Nature slowly reclaims the land. Vines curl around pillars, moss carpets cobblestones, and birds nest in crumbling towers. Yet there is beauty in this reclamation, a sense that life endures even when memory fails. As you descend, you find a cemetery. Headstones lean drunkenly, inscriptions worn smooth. You brush away leaves and soil to glimpse fragments, names, dates, symbols. Some graves belong to people whose existence is now known only through these faint traces. Others bear no markings at all. You ponder the countless lives entirely erased, their contributions, joys, and griefs swallowed by time. You move to the outskirts, where the terrain grows wild. Ruins thin into scattered stones, then disappear entirely. Yet traces remain: pottery shards in fields, fragments of tools, a partially buried mural depicting a festival that might never have been documented. The further you go, the more evident it becomes that human history is a palimpsest, overwritten repeatedly, with whole chapters scraped away. A sudden gust of wind carries a smell of damp earth and charred wood. You turn to see the remains of a collapsed structure, its beams blackened from fire. You imagine the disaster that struck the civilization, perhaps an invasion, a conflagration, a natural catastrophe, or simply the slow erosion of time. And you realize some histories are lost not because someone erased them deliberately, but because accidents, neglect, and nature intervened. The absence is real, yet its cause is often obscured. Humor creeps in again. You find a partially toppled statue with a comically disproportionate nose and smile. You chuckle, thinking, even in death, civilizations seem to mock themselves. Time may erase names and events, but it cannot entirely erase the quirks, the absurdities, the humanity that once thrived. Night falls and the valley darkens. You light a small lantern, casting flickering shadows across the ruins. Crickets chirp, owls hoot. In this quiet, absence is palpable. You feel both awe and melancholy. These civilizations, erased or forgotten, leave traces that tease, frustrate, and captivate. Their absence is a story in itself, a reminder of how fragile memory is and how vast the unknown truly remains. You lie on a fallen column, gazing at the stars. Somewhere, perhaps across oceans or mountains, other lost civilizations whisper in ruins you will never see. You feel connected to them, a transient witness to their echoes. And then it strikes you. Lost civilizations are more than historical gaps. They are reminders of human resilience, creativity, and vulnerability. They are warnings and invitations, warning us how easily memory fades, inviting us to seek, to question, and to imagine. As you drift toward sleep under a canopy of constellations, you carry the lesson forward. History is not linear, neat, or complete. Some civilizations vanish completely, leaving only stones, dust, and fragments. Others are deliberately erased, overwritten by conquerors or rulers seeking to shape perception. And a few stubbornly leave traces that defy deletion, whispers of worlds that once were, waiting for those awake enough to notice. The valley lies quiet now, a sleeping testament to centuries lost. You rise, lantern in hand, knowing the journey is far from over. The gaps are growing wider, the mysteries deeper, and the stories more astonishing than you ever imagined. The morning air is thick with smoke, or perhaps it's the scent of imagination, for what you are about to witness is less a single event than a pattern repeated countless times. The slow, relentless, and sometimes absurd destruction of human memory. History, you realize, is fragile. It can be shredded by a single careless candle, devoured by a flood, gnawed by a mouse, or simply evaporated under the weight of human error. You enter a medieval library, perched atop a hill, its walls blackened from an earlier blaze. The air smells faintly of ash and parchment. Piles of charred scrolls litter the floor, curling like tiny skeletons of stories that once mattered. A single monk kneels amidst the ruins, carefully sifting through the remains of a manuscript. His face is pale, eyes wide with the realization that an entire chronicle, maybe a lifetime of work, is gone. You watch him, and a thought surfaces. This is not malice. This is the slow comedy of accidents. The monk picks up a fragment, and you notice a tiny burn mark in the corner. Perhaps someone left a candle too close. Perhaps a lamp tipped over. Perhaps fate simply enjoys irony. The words are partially legible. A date here, a name there, a war or festival long forgotten, and then gone. The manuscript crumbles in his hands. He sighs, muttering, "Well, at least the cheese was not burned." The humor is dark, but necessary, a human coping mechanism in the face of total loss. You wander further into the library, stepping over broken shelves. Scrolls and codices lie strewn across the floor, some partially waterlogged from a flood that struck months ago. Mud streaks the pages, smudging ink that once chronicled rulers, wars, and entire economies. Someone, or some group, had tried to save them. Others were left behind, sacrificed to expediency or simply misjudgment. You imagine the panic. A librarian realizing too late that a rainstorm has transformed centuries of knowledge into pulp. Outside, a courtyard garden has been abandoned, weeds curling around toppled benches and statues. In the distance, you spot a small rodent scuttling across a parchment-covered table. A single bite, and a few words, maybe a sentence, vanish from human memory forever. You pause, imagining the irony. An entire dynasty or philosophical treatise undone by a bored mouse. It is both absurd and horrifying. As you leave the library, you walk into a town square partially submerged by a recent flood. Stalls lie toppled, wares float down streets like miniature boats. Merchants argue over lost accounts, scribes lament missing ledgers, and townsfolk attempt to salvage whatever they can from the murky water. You realize that water is an unkind historian. It doesn't care about significance, lineage, or who deserves to be remembered. It simply erases. You notice a craftsman carefully drying his tools. "My father's records, gone," he mutters, "and his father's before him. Perhaps all of it is lost." You nod, feeling the weight of generations evaporating into mud. A child splashes nearby, oblivious, laughing. There is poetry in their ignorance, tragedy in the adult's despair. History is accidental, preservation is heroic. You climb a hill overlooking the town and see other disasters etched into the landscape. Fire-blackened rooftops, collapsed barns, and crumbling bridges mark centuries of neglect, accidents, and natural calamities. You spot an old mill, its wheel stuck in place, evidence of floods long past. You imagine the scribes, farmers, and artisans who tried to record their existence, only for fate to intervene with a fickle hand. Dark humor emerges again. You see a monk attempting to document events on damp paper, quill slipping, ink pooling in random splatters. "Perhaps I'll just note, everything burned again," he mutters. You laugh quietly. Human error is persistent, repetitive, and profoundly relatable. It is the unintentional erasure that no historian can fully account for. In a nearby monastery, you witness a similar tragedy. A stack of manuscripts toppled when a shelf gave way. Some scrolls land in a puddle, others on jagged stones, ripping delicate pages. A novice attempts to rescue them, but in doing so, smudges ink across adjacent works. Chaos reigns, yet life goes on. Candles flicker, bread is baked, prayers continue. The world refuses to pause for meticulous preservation. Accidents shape history as much as rulers or wars. You wander toward a distant hill, where the ruins of a noble estate stand. Its records, once meticulously maintained, have suffered centuries of fires, floods, and neglect. A single ledger might survive, hinting at a lost lineage, a forgotten tax record, or a vanished architectural feat. Yet, much is gone, leaving tantalizing gaps that tempt scholars and storytellers alike. You think of the irony. So much human effort undone by the randomness of daily life. In the forest nearby, you find remnants of a monastery destroyed by a fire decades earlier. Roof beams collapse into charred piles. Scrolls smolder in the dirt. The occasional bird perches atop the ruins, indifferent to the loss below. You imagine the monks' scribes who ran through flames, desperately rescuing fragments, only to discover that centuries of meticulous work were reduced to ash and smoke. History, it seems, is always under siege, from human folly, from nature, and from time itself. Yet there is resilience, too. You notice some manuscripts, partially burned but legible, tucked into crevices. A clever archivist once preserved them in a nook or chest, leaving traces of knowledge for future generations. The contrast between destruction and survival feels almost poetic. Every fragment saved is a rebellion against the inevitability of loss. You pause near a charred candle holder, imagining the countless other accidents: candles tipping over, ink jars spilling, scrolls dropping into puddles. Perhaps an entire political plot vanished because a scribe sneezed. Perhaps a philosopher's magnum opus was reduced to cinders because someone left the window open during a rainstorm. You laugh softly, the absurdity cutting through the melancholy. History is built on the narrow margin between diligence and disaster. As twilight descends, you wander through a valley scarred by past calamities. Rivers shifted courses, forests encroach on abandoned settlements, and stone walls crumble under wind and rain. You sense that these losses are cumulative. Fires, floods, accidents, and human errors compound over generations, creating gaps that no chronicler could ever fully repair. Yet, life persists. Villages rebuild, scholars write anew, and children laugh where ancestors once toiled. Destruction and renewal are intertwined. Night falls fully, and the ruins glow faintly in the moonlight. The air carries the scent of damp earth, ash, and forgotten parchment. You lie beneath a ruined arch, listening to the whisper of the wind through collapsed roofs. You realize a profound truth. Humanity's story is fragile, precarious, and perpetually threatened by forces both monumental and absurd. And yet, for every fire, every flood, every careless hand that erased knowledge, there remain fragments, small, stubborn, stubbornly persistent, that allow the past to whisper to the present. They tease, they tantalize, they haunt. The accidental erasers of history have shaped our understanding as much as conquerors, kings, or scribes. You drift into uneasy sleep beneath the remnants of crumbled roofs, aware that tomorrow you will continue wandering, searching for traces of civilizations erased, rebuilt, and remembered only in fragments. Fires, floods, and human error may destroy, but they also illuminate the resilience, humor, and tenacity of human memory, and the ever-present gaps that define our understanding of time. The morning sun casts a golden haze over the capital of an empire, sprawling across marble columns, cobblestone streets, and banners fluttering with heraldic symbols. But today, you notice something peculiar. The grandeur of the city feels curated, rehearsed, as if reality itself has been slightly rearranged. You step closer and realize why. Here, history is not left to chance. Here, it is carefully edited, polished, and rewritten to serve the ambitions of the powerful. You enter the imperial palace, a monument of both awe and intimidation. The halls echo with the footsteps of courtiers, generals, and scribes. The emperor, seated upon a throne carved with scenes of glorious victories, gestures imperiously. His presence is undeniable, and yet, in the quiet corners of the hall, you begin to suspect that some of these victories never occurred. A council meeting is underway. Ministers shuffle scrolls, cross out inconvenient names, and adjust the chronology of past battles. If we record that the Northern Rebellion occurred 2 years earlier, one minister whispers, it makes the emperor's victory appear more decisive. Another nods. And we can erase mention of General Leontius. He was troublesome anyway. You marvel at the precision and audacity. Power is absolute when one controls memory. You wander down a corridor lined with tapestries. They depict kings and generals, heroes and gods, in scenes of unparalleled valor. But as you examine them closely, the inconsistencies become apparent. A battle supposedly fought in one city appears to be in another. Armors reflect styles that existed decades apart. Some faces seem familiar, others wholly imagined. The tapestries are propaganda as much as art, curated to create a story that suits those in power. History is, after all, a performance, and the stage is the imagination of the rulers. In a small study, a historian quills furiously, rewriting genealogies. The last 3 rulers, he murmurs. Let's adjust their lifespan slightly. Shift one's birth by 5 years. Perfect. No one will notice. Nearby, a scribe sketches maps, moving borders, rivers, and cities, as if reality itself can be redrawn with ink and parchment. You realize that entire empires are built not just on conquest, but on the selective shaping of memory. Humor appears in subtle ways. A jester strolls by, balancing a stack of censored documents. He comments loudly, "Ah yes, history. Now it's much prettier than reality." Courtiers laugh, though nervously. Humor is tolerated, but only when it doesn't threaten the narrative. It is both a relief and a subtle tool to reinforce conformity. You step into the emperor's library, a labyrinth of scrolls and codices. Some documents are authentic, recording events as they occurred. Others are edited, some entirely fabricated, detailing triumphs that never happened and villains who never existed. Marginal notes reveal the process: names added, battles shifted, dates adjusted. Occasionally, The emperor himself has annotated texts, demanding that events be described in ways that glorify him. Power, you realize, is inseparable from the control of perception. Outside, the streets are alive with citizens celebrating festivals, many of which commemorate events that never occurred. A parade passes by, featuring banners declaring victories over imaginary foes. Soldiers march with precision, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, that they are enacting triumphs recorded only on paper. The world below moves forward, oblivious to the alterations imposed from above. And in this way, the rewriting of history becomes a lived reality. You visit a hall of statues, each representing legendary rulers and generals. One, you notice, bears the name of a king who, according to previous records, should not exist. Another depicts a general who never commanded an army. You step back and realize that empire and imagination are inseparable. Sculptors and scribes alike craft a collective memory designed to awe, inspire, and manipulate. In a dimly lit chamber, a group of scribes meet secretly to compare official records with older, unofficial manuscripts. If the emperor discovers the discrepancies, one whispers, we are in danger. They examine previous accounts, noting differences and adjusting accordingly. History becomes a living thing, rewritten daily to match the desires of those who hold authority. Truth is negotiable, perception is law. You pause in a corridor hung with painted maps. Borders have shifted inexplicably. Cities appear where none existed. Mountains vanish. Rivers curve differently. These changes are deliberate, designed to consolidate claims, intimidate rivals, and erase inconvenient realities. You notice the subtle artistry involved. Even falsified history is crafted to seem natural, inevitable, and convincing. A messenger arrives with news of a rebellion, one that challenges the official record of peace. The emperor listens, then orders the event rewritten. Documents are dispatched to neighboring courts, describing the rebellion as minor and swiftly crushed. Soldiers returning from the field are instructed to report victories rather than defeats. In this way, the empire controls not only memory, but narrative, ensuring that history aligns with ambition. As night falls, the palace glows in lantern light. Courtiers gather for a feast celebrating a victory that occurred only in texts. Music plays, wine flows, and laughter echoes through the marble halls. You realize that every empire has its ghosts. Victories invented, rivals erased, entire events fabricated to craft a coherent and flattering past. Power depends on perception, and perception depends on the stories that survive. You leave the palace through a quiet garden, reflecting on what you've witnessed. Fires, floods, and accidents destroy history, but here, deliberate design shapes it. Both forms leave gaps, some accidental, others intentional. And both, you realize, are equally consequential. Humanity remembers what survives, and what survives is often curated by those with ambition, ego, and the desire to control. The wind rustles through trees as you walk down a moonlit path. Lanterns flicker across hedges, casting shadows that seem to whisper secrets. The palace behind you is both beautiful and unsettling, a monument not only to wealth and power, but to the malleability of history itself. Every tapestry, every scroll, every statue has been touched by hands that understand the advantage of erasure. Reality is flexible when memory is a tool, and the consequences ripple far beyond the palace walls. By the time you reach the edge of the city, you understand a fundamental truth. Empires survive not merely through armies or wealth, but through the careful cultivation of memory. They rewrite the past to secure the present, shaping identity, loyalty, and perception for generations to come. And for those of us awake enough to notice, the gaps, the inconsistencies, and the deliberate erasures offer glimpses of a history both richer and stranger than the official record would suggest. As stars begin to twinkle above the city, you linger in the quiet, contemplating the audacity of human ambition. Entire centuries, victories, and rulers may be invented or erased, yet the world below continues, oblivious, performing the script written for it long before you arrived. And you, the observer, are both witness and participant in the strange theater of history, where power, imagination, and memory collide. You step out into a vast plain that stretches beyond the horizon. The morning mist clings to the ground like a shroud, and the air hums with quiet expectation. Somewhere beneath the fog, civilizations have risen and fallen, but today you are acutely aware of the centuries that linger only as whispers. Europe, Asia, the Middle East, each with its own gaps, silences, and ghostly absences. You start in a European town, cobbled streets echoing with the clatter of hooves and cartwheels. The square is oddly empty for mid-morning. A marketplace stalls, partially abandoned, as though vendors are cautious about the very day they exist in. Signs bear dates that don't match anything recorded in chronicles. Town criers shout conflicting proclamations. Year 934, year 1027, year 996 again. You tilt your head, realizing that entire European centuries seem to flicker, appear, and vanish like candlelight. As you wander, you notice churches whose architecture seems to belong to different eras simultaneously. Gothic arches intersect with Romanesque walls. A fresco depicts a saint long thought to have lived centuries earlier than the building itself. Local stories are contradictory, each family preserving its own version of events, each claiming ancestry and lineage that don't quite line up. You realize the gaps aren't random. They span centuries, stretching across cultures, disrupting continuity in ways both subtle and blatant. A boat takes you across the Mediterranean toward the Middle East. You pass ruins that hint at grand empires, libraries filled with manuscripts that no longer exist, palaces partially buried beneath sand, and marketplaces that have never been fully documented. You hear stories of scholars who counted centuries twice or skipped them entirely. Baghdad, long a hub of learning, is layered with evidence of texts that existed and vanished. Maps show roads and cities that historians can only speculate about. You touch a carved stone, feeling the ghost of an empire, a civilization caught between being and not being. In Persia, you wander through an abandoned city whose layout seems impossibly advanced for the recorded era. Streets intersect with bridges that have vanished in official accounts. Irrigation channels hint at technology that doesn't appear until centuries later. Local legends speak of kings whose names appear nowhere else. Artifacts lie scattered, some carefully preserved, others cracked or buried. It is as if someone deliberately folded history, hiding entire chapters in the margins of reality. You travel further east, to China, walking along what seems to be the remnants of a vast trade route. Cities vanish and reappear, tombs bear dates that contradict neighboring records, and dynasties seem to shift abruptly. Scholars in distant courtyards argue over gaps, dynasties without clear succession, inventions appearing suddenly, and rulers whose existence is inferred only from fragments of texts. You feel a faint chill, realizing that the silence between major events is louder than any written record. Along the Silk Road, traders carry goods from lands both real and imagined. Pottery shards depict scenes unknown to surviving texts. Coins bear dates that contradict official histories. You speak to a merchant who shrugs. It's always been like this. Sometimes the year is missing. Sometimes the ruler doesn't exist. But trade goes on. Life continues. You laugh softly, understanding the strange resilience of human society, persisting despite temporal uncertainty. In a desert ruin, you find fragments of astronomical charts, half-deciphered texts, and inscriptions hinting at knowledge now lost. You imagine generations of astronomers and mathematicians whose calculations, observations, and discoveries disappeared before they could fully shape history. Their work persists only as hints, tantalizing and incomplete. These ghost centuries are a testament to knowledge lost, to human endeavor rendered invisible. Humor creeps in amidst the melancholy. You stumble upon a faded mural depicting kings of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, all gathered in a mythical council that never existed. One of them waves, a faint grin on his painted face. You laugh quietly, the absurdity striking. History itself seems to joke at the expense of the living, playing with the timeline like a trickster. Textbooks don't tell you about. From medieval scribes accidentally burning priceless records to empires rewriting the past, as dusk falls, you find yourself atop a hill overlooking overlapping ruins. Towers, walls, and bridges crumbling side by side, each representing different eras yet coexisted awkwardly. The horizon is fragmented, cities rising and falling like musical notes in a dissonant symphony. You realize that these ghost centuries are not isolated anomalies, but a global pattern, silences and gaps mirrored across continents, suggesting a shared vulnerability of human memory and record-keeping. You walk through a courtyard where scholars once debated philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. Inscriptions on walls have vanished, manuscripts burned or stolen, libraries swallowed by flood or fire. One inscription hints at an innovation centuries ahead of its recorded time. Another commemorates a ruler never verified by other sources. Every fragment is a mystery, a challenge, a puzzle. History here is a shadow, waiting for the curious to notice its absence. Night falls. The stars stretch across the sky, constant and indifferent. In this quiet, the scale of absence becomes clear. Centuries erased, knowledge lost, rulers forgotten, and yet life continues beneath the surface. In villages, towns, and cities, people continue to live, work, trade, and love, oblivious to the ghostly gaps above them. And you, walking through these echoes, realize the unsettling truth. Humanity exists atop layers of missing memory, unaware of the centuries that never were, or that we may never fully know. You pause at a crumbling arch, listening to the wind carry faint whispers of lost voices. Traders, scholars, warriors, poets, all vanished, their existence inferred only from fragmentary traces. You feel both awe and sorrow. These gaps, these ghost centuries, are not simply academic puzzles. They are living absences, shaping culture, perception, and identity in ways we scarcely recognize. You continue walking, tracing roads that no longer connect, entering buildings partially buried, touching stones smoothed by centuries of wind and neglect. Every ruin is a testament to human ingenuity, fragility, and impermanence. Some gaps may have been deliberate, others accidental, some erased by ambition, others by nature. And all of them leave traces, faint yet persistent, calling out to those who are willing to listen. By midnight, you rest atop a hill, the glow of distant cities flickering below. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, ghost centuries breathe in silence, leaving only fragments for the awake to piece together. You close your eyes and consider the magnitude of what is missing. Rulers, discoveries, entire cultures rendered invisible, not always by choice, sometimes by chance, often by both. The silence between the lines is louder than any chronicle. And as you drift into sleep beneath the star-filled sky, one thought lingers. History is not only what we remember, but also what we fail to record, what disappears, and what remains just out of reach. The ghost centuries are not lost. They are waiting, whispering, teasing, and challenging us to see the world as it was, as it could have been, and as it is in its imperfect, patchwork form. You begin your day at a wind-swept dig site, the kind of place where the earth itself seems to guard its secrets jealously. Dust swirls in the morning sun, and the wind carries the faint tang of stone, clay, and history. Here, in the dirt beneath your boots, lies evidence that refuses to obey the tidy timelines written in books. Archaeology, you realize, is history's stubborn counterpoint, the mute rebel challenging what we think we know. A team of archaeologists works carefully, brushing centuries of soil from shards of pottery. One shard is curious, etched with symbols that don't appear anywhere in existing records. "This shouldn't exist yet," mutters a young researcher, eyes wide with disbelief. "Chronologically, it's impossible." You lean closer, inspecting the fragment. Its edges are worn, its markings precise, undeniable. The textbook timeline disagrees, yet the evidence is incontrovertible. History, it seems, is being contradicted, one shard at a time. Nearby, a partially buried wall hints at an architectural style that predates its supposed invention by decades. Researchers measure, document, and argue. Some say it's a misinterpretation. Others point out that multiple sites show the same anomaly. Frustration bubbles like an underground spring. You watch as one archaeologist scribbles in frustration. "Rewrite 200 years of history with one piece of stone? Yes, yes you do." You smile. The absurdity is perfect. An entire chronology challenged by a handful of bricks. You wander through a trench, noting the precise layering of soil. Pottery shards from seemingly impossible eras lie side by side. Coins, jewelry, and tools bear markings inconsistent with official narratives. A small bone fragment, carbon-dated meticulously, suggests humans existed in ways historians never predicted. You feel a thrill of discovery. The ground remembers what books forget or deliberately omit. In a nearby tent, a debate rages. One historian insists that the find must be an anomaly, a fluke, or a forgery. Another argues for the evidence, holding up diagrams, stratigraphy, and radiocarbon results. You watch, fascinated, as the clash between physical proof and written record unfolds. The tension is palpable. Paper versus dirt, authority versus evidence, tradition versus stubborn reality. Humor creeps in amidst the intensity. A graduate student points to a misaligned shard, joking, "Well, apparently someone in 900 AD was more advanced than we thought. Either that or aliens." Laughter bubbles up from the team, a brief respite from the mounting absurdity. And yet, even in jest, the truth remains. Evidence refuses to lie, even when history does. You follow a narrow trench deeper into the site. Layers of earth reveal settlements built atop settlements. Foundations shifted, burned, rebuilt. Each stratum is a testament to human persistence, yet also a puzzle challenging chronology. A ceramic vessel, remarkably intact, bears an inscription that references a ruler whose existence was previously dismissed as myth. You trace the letters with your fingers, realizing that one small artifact can topple centuries of assumed knowledge. Nearby, a skeletal grave is uncovered. Osteologists examine the bones, noting wear patterns, diet, and injuries. Yet even in death, contradictions arise. The skeleton's age does not match burial customs recorded in texts. Grave goods suggest a cultural sophistication far beyond what is documented. A researcher shakes her head. "It's like the people wrote their own history in secret," she mutters. You nod in agreement, understanding that archaeology often whispers the truths that scribes either forgot or chose to erase. In the afternoon, you move to a partially excavated temple. Frescoes, faded but intact, depict scenes of daily life, religious ceremonies, and trade. Some details contradict official records. Boats with rigging styles not yet invented, garments from regions supposedly unconnected, rituals entirely unrecorded. A senior archaeologist points to a mural and says wryly, "Apparently, the textbooks were on vacation for a few centuries." You chuckle quietly. History is messy, and sometimes hilariously so. You continue to survey the site, noticing the footprints of animals, erosion patterns, and remnants of fires. Each detail adds context, grounding the artifacts in reality. Written records often ignore these mundane clues, but they are essential pieces of the puzzle, helping reconstruct lives, economies, and societies. One finds humor in the fact that a squirrel nibbling on a clay tablet centuries ago may have altered what we know, or think we know, about the past. As dusk approaches, you climb a ridge overlooking the dig. The landscape stretches wide, abandoned fields, collapsed dwellings, and winding paths, all layered with centuries of occupation and abandonment. You realize the scale of what archaeology confronts: millennia of human activity, partially recorded, partially lost, often misremembered, but indelibly imprinted in the earth. Night descends, lanterns flickering on the dig. Researchers pack away delicate finds, covering trenches, labeling fragments, and noting inconsistencies. You watch a scholar carefully wrap a shard, muttering, "Somewhere, someone's timeline is about to get very confused." Humor mingles with reverence. The tension between disbelief and wonder is almost tangible. Every piece uncovered is a small rebellion against the official story. You lie back on the ridge, gazing at the stars. The constellations have endured longer than any text or temple. They remind you that while history may be rewritten, lost, or misremembered, evidence endures. Pottery shards, bones, foundations, and murals do not lie. They challenge authority, provoke thought, and demand reconsideration. Archaeology is both a detective story and a confrontation with human hubris. A gentle breeze carries the scent of earth and stone. You feel the weight of centuries pressing lightly against your shoulders. Each artifact, no matter how small, carries a story that complicates the neat narratives in books. Some evidence confirms what we know, some contradicts. Some teasing gaps, errors, and omissions. And all of it demands careful attention, patience, and humility. As you drift into sleep beside the trench, lanterns flickering softly, one thought lingers. The ground remembers what history forgets. Every dig, every shard, every carbon-dated bone is a challenge, a question, a whisper from the past saying, check again, think again. Perhaps you do not know as much as you think. In this confrontation between archaeology and official record, you understand the paradox. Human memory is fragile, but the earth is stubborn. And through the soil, the stones, and the artifacts, centuries-long silences can speak, offering glimpses of realities that official histories either ignore or deny. You awaken in a village at the edge of a medieval forest. Mist curls around timber-framed houses, and smoke rises lazily from chimneys. The streets are cobbled, uneven, and familiar. Yet something feels off. A glance at the market square reveals merchants hawking goods that seem out of sequence with what the textbooks suggest should exist. It's subtle at first. A plow slightly more advanced than expected, a clock mechanism decades ahead of its recorded invention. And then the realization strikes. You have stepped into the gap between what history tells us happened and what actually occurred. You wander down a main thoroughfare, noticing people engaging in crafts that appear astonishingly sophisticated for their supposed time. A blacksmith hammers metal with a precision that, according to the records, shouldn't exist for another century. Across the street, a baker shapes bread with a technique that wouldn't be documented until centuries later. You pause, squinting, trying to reconcile what you see with the linear timelines you've memorized. The discrepancy is jarring. Entire regions seem to have leapt forward, skipping decades or even centuries of development. The town crier bellows the date. You note it carefully. It doesn't match any consistent timeline you know. Nearby, a scholar pores over parchments, muttering about conflicting calendars. You overhear fragments. No, that emperor wasn't alive yet, but the bridge exists. How? The village itself becomes a living illustration of the medieval time skip. Architecture, tools, and social organization all advance suddenly, with minimal transitional evidence. You follow a narrow alley to a workshop where artisans carve intricate woodwork. The style is refined, detailed, and distinctly ahead of its supposed time. You observe a young apprentice carefully copying patterns from a master, patterns that, according to official records, should have been impossible for decades. The workshop is full of life, but also mystery. How did this knowledge exist here before it was supposed to? Time, it seems, has skipped over centuries, leaving fragments of understanding without context. Further along, you find a bridge, crossing a gently flowing river. Its construction is sophisticated, using engineering principles not thought to have been applied until much later. You walk across it slowly, feeling the craftsmanship beneath your feet, marveling at the fact that no texts describe this construction. Where are the manuals? Where are the records of labor, payment, and design? Bridges like this, and roads, appear suddenly in the archaeological record, without the gradual evolution historians expect. You visit the town square again, noting public clocks mounted on towers. Their mechanisms are advanced, yet there are no surviving records detailing their invention or installation. Villagers consult them as if they were always there. You realize the pattern. Tools, structures, and social systems emerge fully formed, leaving historians and archaeologists to puzzle over sudden leaps in knowledge and capability. Curiosity leads you to a library, modest yet bustling. Manuscripts are neatly stacked, some documenting scientific observations, trade logs, and technological schematics. Yet something is off. The manuscripts jump decades in their narrative, missing the steps between discovery and application. You leaf through a text detailing water wheel improvements that should have evolved slowly, but instead appear suddenly perfected. Marginal notes suggest debate and revision, but the in-between stages, the messy, trial-and-error progress of human invention, are absent. Entire periods seem to have been skipped or erased. You walk into a small chapel at the edge of the village. Frescoes on the walls depict events that are centuries out of place, figures whose attire doesn't match documented timelines. Priests perform rituals with instruments and techniques that should not yet exist. You catch a child practicing calligraphy in a style historically inconsistent with the alleged year. Even daily life, from dress to tools, seems compressed, accelerated, as though centuries were folded together. You pause to observe a group of merchants unloading goods from a wagon. Some items are clearly regional, others foreign. Trade networks appear far more expansive than expected for the time. There are coins from regions not documented as connected yet, fabrics woven in patterns not known until centuries later. The flow of commerce itself seems to have leapt ahead, bypassing incremental steps that would normally leave traces in records and inventories. Time, in this village, refuses to follow the textbook. Humor, as ever, creeps in. A dog chases a child through the square, knocking over a basket of apples. One of the apples rolls near a ledger with a date that contradicts everything else. You laugh quietly, thinking, perhaps even mundane accidents contribute to historical confusion. Maybe someone centuries later would interpret this as evidence of trade or taxation, unaware that life itself is inherently messy, unpredictable, and nonlinear. You climb a hill overlooking the town and the surrounding countryside. Villages and farms spread out below, roads connecting them in seemingly impossible patterns. The landscape itself suggests planning, growth, and innovation that defy recorded timelines. You spot structures, barns, granaries, and mills that appear suddenly, fully formed, without transitional predecessors. The earth holds evidence of leaps, jumps, and sudden progressions that history books ignore or rationalize awkwardly. At twilight, you return to the village center. The townspeople go about their routines, oblivious to the anomalies around them. Bakers work with advanced ovens. Blacksmiths create tools that should be centuries ahead. Children learn skills centuries out of place. You realize that entire communities may have experienced accelerated development, leaving no record of the missing decades or centuries that connected the dots. You wander the empty streets under moonlight, contemplating the strangeness of it all. Where are the roads, the workshops, the incremental innovations that should exist between A and B? Why do structures, skills, and knowledge appear fully realized, leaving a gap in the narrative? You feel the eerie pull of the medieval time skip, a puzzle, a whisper of missing centuries, a challenge to everything we assume about historical continuity. You settle atop a stone wall, gazing at the stars. Across the village, lights flicker from homes, chimneys smoke, and the distant hum of life continues. The time skip is subtle yet profound, visible only when you pay attention to the small inconsistencies in architecture, tools, trade, and daily life. It is a reminder that history is not always a smooth progression. Sometimes it leaps, folds, or skips entirely, leaving gaps that puzzle generations to come. And as you drift to sleep under the cool night sky, one thought lingers. The past is not a straight line. It jumps, folds, and surprises, leaving us with a patchwork of eras that may never fully align. The medieval time skip is everywhere if you know how to look, silent, subtle, and astonishing. You step into a village that seems caught in the pause between life and catastrophe. Smoke curls from chimneys, but the streets are strangely silent. Doors hang ajar, livestock graze unchecked. The air carries a faint coppery tang, the scent of earth disturbed and blood long dried. Something has happened here, though the record books remain frustratingly vague. You are witnessing the aftermath of cascading disasters that erased not only lives, but entire chapters of history. In the town square, a bell tolls lazily, marking an hour that may no longer exist. You see remnants of market stalls, overturned and empty. Merchants have fled or died, leaving coins scattered on the ground. A basket of vegetables rots in the sun, partially eaten by birds. You pause, imagining the confusion that struck daily life, one day bustling and organized, the next chaos and absence. In a small home, you find manuscripts damp from rain, ink running in rivulets. A scribe once recorded the births, deaths, and deeds of townspeople, but now the parchment curls and tears in the corners. The handwriting fades, smudged, barely legible. A tiny margin note reads, "Plague took the smith. Burnt the records of his deeds. God forgive me." You realize that entire networks of knowledge, lineage, and local events vanish with sudden disasters, leaving gaps historians struggle to fill. Outside, a war horn echoes faintly in the distance. You glimpse a band of soldiers returning from the front lines, gaunt, exhausted, carrying wounded and the spoils of uncertain battles. Villagers peer cautiously from hiding places, uncertain if these arrivals signal protection or destruction. Towns are razed, archives burned, and scribes either flee or die. The coordination of society, its memory, its chronology, begins to fray. When chaos strikes, record-keeping becomes an afterthought, and centuries slip silently into the void. In a ruined chapel, frescoes have been scraped or charred, leaving only hints of what was once vibrant. One faintly visible scene depicts a feast interrupted by calamity, a subtle allegory of the real-life collapse unfolding outside. You run your hand along the wall, feeling the grooves carved by desperation and fear. Art, history, and human experience all become casualties when plague and war collide. Humor sneaks in briefly, dark and sardonic. A small dog scampers through rubble, barking at a crow perched atop a toppled bell tower. The absurdity strikes you. Life persists even amid devastation, and nature continues its cycles, indifferent to human tragedy. A plague doesn't consult the calendar, a war doesn't check the official timeline. You enter a partially burned library. Scrolls are blackened, charred, some unreadable. Others are soaked from firefighting attempts, or perhaps rainfall. Among the ruins, a manuscript survives, water-stained but legible. Its content contradicts chronicles elsewhere. Events misdated, victories overstated, losses underplayed. A scholar examines it, muttering, "Everything we knew, wrong, or incomplete. Again." You smile wryly, noting that disasters, intentional or accidental, are relentless editors of history. You wander through a battlefield on the outskirts of the village. Rusted weapons, splintered shields, and skeletal remains litter the soil. The scale of loss is staggering, and you realize that every fallen soldier represents a story lost, a name unrecorded, a lineage broken. Records of battles, campaigns, and negotiations are scattered, inconsistent, or obliterated entirely. War, like plague, creates gaps, not only in lives, but in the very fabric of historical memory. Further along, survivors gather in the remains of a town hall, trying to reconstruct what has been lost. Papers are salvaged, lists hastily rewritten, and oral histories passed down amid confusion. You notice a farmer arguing with a scholar over dates and events. The farmer gestures wildly at a destroyed barn. "It burned last year." The scholar shakes his head. "According to this ledger, it burned 3 years ago." You realize that human memory itself becomes unreliable when catastrophe strikes, further compounding historical gaps. Night falls. The village bathed in a reddish-orange glow from fires that still smolder. You see shadows of people moving cautiously, scavenging what remains. Rats scurry through ruined homes, insects hum, and the wind carries the scent of smoke, decay, and fear. Amid this chaos, life persists, stubborn and unorganized. Records crumble, and centuries vanish silently, leaving historians centuries later to puzzle over absence. You climb a nearby hill to observe the broader landscape. Fields are scorched, roads disrupted, and settlements partially destroyed. Nature has reclaimed parts of the terrain. Rivers have overflowed, washing away bridges and mills. You understand that plague, war, and natural disasters combine in unpredictable ways, each amplifying the other's erasure of memory. One missing bridge, one flooded archive, one scorched manuscript. Cumulatively, they carve holes in the historical record that may never be fully repaired. Humor, grim as it is, returns in fleeting moments. A lone goat wanders into a deserted marketplace, nibbling on a ledger. The absurdity strikes you. History can be literally consumed, digested, erased by circumstance, accident, or animal. You laugh quietly, aware that amidst tragedy, the mundane continues, indifferent and often ridiculous. As midnight settles, you rest on the hilltop, gazing at distant fires dotting the landscape. The scale of human fragility becomes apparent. Centuries of progress, governance, and culture can vanish in months or years under the weight of plague and war. Yet traces persist. Burned manuscripts, ruined structures, fragmentary inscriptions. These fragments are tenuous, but they offer glimpses of lives, events, and societies that would otherwise vanish entirely. You think of scribes who survived, recording fragments of what they could, sometimes rearranging dates to make sense of the chaos. You imagine the historians, centuries later, piecing together evidence from charred remains and oral testimony, frustrated by the gaps and inconsistencies. And you understand the paradox. Human effort can both preserve and lose history simultaneously, leaving a patchwork of partial records for future generations. Finally, under a sky heavy with clouds, you descend from the hilltop. The village sleeps, or at least lies in uneasy rest, the echoes of calamity lingering in empty streets and smoldering ruins. Plague, war, fire, and flood have combined to erase centuries' worth of knowledge, yet the memory survives in whispers, fragments, and the stubborn resilience of life itself. And as you close your eyes, one thought persists. When everything falls apart at once, history becomes a fragile patchwork stitched together from surviving threads. And in the gaps between those threads lie the stories we may never fully know. You enter a dimly lit study, the scent of parchment, ink, and candle smoke thick in the air. Scrolls and codices teeter in precarious stacks, some yellowed and brittle, others freshly inked with meticulous calligraphy. The room is cluttered chaos, yet every surface bears evidence of the historian's struggle, a desperate attempt to make sense of the fragments, gaps, and contradictions left behind by centuries of loss. At a central desk, a Renaissance-era scholar leans over a manuscript, quill scratching furiously. A cat lounges atop a pile of papers, tail flicking, occasionally knocking marginal notes onto the floor. No, that date cannot be correct, the scholar mutters, scanning chronicles from distant lands. But if I adjust it by 5 years, it aligns with this other fragment. Maybe. He pauses, frustrated, and scribbles a correction in the margin. You realize that human ambition, interpretation, and sometimes laziness shape the very history we inherit. The scholar's assistant, younger and more cautious, points out discrepancies between sources. But sir, the two kings cannot be the same person. One supposedly died decades earlier. The scholar waves a hand impatiently. Sources are messy. Chronology is negotiable. The cat swishes its tail as though agreeing, indifferent to truth. Humor creeps in, despite the gravity. Even the most meticulous historians were forced to improvise, sometimes with absurd results. You wander through the study, noting the variety of sources spread across tables, letters, tax records, foreign chronicles, oral testimonies. Each conflicts with the others in subtle or dramatic ways. The historian pauses, frowning at a ledger listing battles, plagues, and rulers. One king appears twice, with overlapping reigns. Another disappears entirely. And yet, a narrative must be created, a coherent story stitched from contradictions. This is the human challenge, imposing order on chaos, sometimes at the cost of accuracy. In a corner, a pile of old maps lies in disarray. Borders shift from one map to another, rivers move, mountains change shape. The scholar examines them, muttering, "Well, this one seems prettier. Let's use it." You watch as artistry, politics, and personal preference intrude on objective truth. Laughter bubbles in spite of yourself. History, in the hands of humans, is often as much imagination as fact. You step to a window and observe the city beyond. Scholars, scribes, and citizens bustle about, each unaware that their deeds and words are being filtered, edited, or occasionally ignored. The historian scribbles a footnote. Sources unreliable. Events inferred. This footnote, almost innocuous, carries the weight of centuries, acknowledging uncertainty while still asserting authority. A messenger arrives with a newly copied manuscript. The scholar examines it and frowns. Marginalia contradicts established texts. Names are misspelled, dates shifted. You notice the scholar's slight grin. Perfect. Now I can adjust the timeline to make sense. The assistant protests, but the scholar ignores him, understanding that sometimes a tidy narrative matters more than strict truth. Humor punctuates the tension again. A pigeon, somehow inside the study, pecks at a manuscript, smearing ink. The scholar sighs. The past conspires against us, even in bird form. You chuckle quietly, realizing that human error, accidents, and small intrusions shape history just as much as ambition and deception. Cats, pigeons, spilled ink, they all leave traces that historians must contend with. You follow the scholar as he consults a distant library. The journey is slow and deliberate, with frequent stops to verify fragments, reconcile discrepancies, and sometimes invent plausible connections. At one point, he discovers a letter that contradicts every other account of a local rebellion. After reading it, he jots a note. Perhaps the rebellion was smaller than reported, or the other sources exaggerated. Decide later. The act of deciding, of choosing which version survives, is itself a form of rewriting history. In a quiet chamber, a circle of historians debates a chronological puzzle. Two rulers with overlapping reigns, one war recorded inconsistently, and an epidemic with no surviving documentation. The discussion grows heated. We must pick one narrative, one scholar insists, otherwise the story collapses. Another protests, but the evidence is clear. After a tense pause, the group compromises, producing a version that satisfies none fully, but appears coherent on paper. Consensus often triumphs over accuracy. You wander back to the study. The cat yawns lazily atop a pile of manuscripts. The scholar scratches his head. He leans back in his chair, muttering, "History is a negotiation, sometimes with facts, sometimes with imagination." The assistant jots notes, quietly recording discrepancies for posterity. Even attempts at honesty are filtered through human limitation, bias, and ambition. The room grows dark as evening descends. Candlelight flickers across parchment, illuminating carefully adjusted genealogies, battle records, and footnotes. You realize the paradox. Historians strive to preserve truth, yet in their striving, they often alter, simplify, or obscure the past, creating stories that survive generations but are sometimes only partially accurate. Humor appears one final time. A scholar, frustrated with conflicting sources, tosses a quill into a candle. It sparks and hisses. "Perhaps the past prefers mystery," he mutters, eyes glinting with wry amusement. The cat watches, tail twitching, as though agreeing. You laugh softly, understanding that the construction of history is as human, flawed, and unpredictable as the people who lived it. You leave the study at night, stepping into the quiet streets. Moonlight glints off cobblestones, illuminating traces of the past, ruins, inscriptions, and fragments of life that survived fire, war, and time. The historian's work continues in shadows, balancing evidence, imagination, and practicality. Without them, the past would be inaccessible. With them, it becomes a curated, imperfect narrative. Finally, you pause at the edge of town, reflecting on the centuries you've witnessed. Historians tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes misleadingly, to piece together human experience. Their mistakes, adjustments, and occasional fabrications have left the historical record as we know it, a mosaic of truth, conjecture, and human error. And as you gaze at the starlit sky, you realize a fundamental truth. History is alive, not just in events themselves, but in the people who interpret, record, and sometimes manipulate them. The past is not a fixed narrative. It is a conversation across centuries, shaped by human hands, minds, and sometimes mischief. You step into a modern city, though the streets feel oddly familiar, like a dream half remembered. Cars hum past, billboards flash advertisements, and digital clocks tick with precision. But something in the rhythm of life feels off. Look closer, and the illusion begins to crack. Dates, events, and technological milestones no longer align neatly. It's as if the past century has been subtly rewritten, or perhaps partially erased. You enter a library, the scent of paper and electronics mingling. A historian sits at a desk, scanning newspapers from the last 100 years. Something is inconsistent. Photographs depict leaders who, according to other sources, never held office at the times listed. Buildings appear in photos before blueprints exist. Social movements emerge suddenly, with no transitional cultural evidence. A faint, uneasy smile crosses your face. The last century may not be as solid as we think. In a nearby museum, exhibits tell familiar stories: wars, inventions, political upheavals. Yet plaques, carefully curated by committees, omit anomalies. You notice inconsistencies. A machine appears decades earlier than documentation allows. A war is described differently than surviving eyewitness accounts suggest. An invention credited to one individual may actually predate them by years, or even decades. The museum becomes a curated reality, highlighting what survives and what might have been smoothed over, edited, or entirely erased. You stroll past a row of digital archives. Scrolling through newspaper clippings, government documents, and personal diaries, patterns emerge. Entire sequences of events are strangely absent. No records, no reports, just sudden jumps in narrative. A historian beside you murmurs, "We can't explain why these decades seem missing. Some call it phantom time, but I hesitate to use the word lightly." You nod. The gaps are subtle, almost imperceptible, but they accumulate, creating a history that feels incomplete. In the streets, people live as if nothing is amiss. Cars drive on roads that may not have existed when they were supposedly built. Buildings rise as if skipping years of architectural evolution. Technology emerges fully formed, sometimes in contradiction with known developmental timelines. You pause outside a skyscraper, considering the blueprint archives. Construction records match official dates, yet archaeological remnants beneath the city tell a different story. The past century may be a patchwork of fact, assumption, and unseen edits. You visit a cafe where intellectuals discuss politics, art, and science. One mentions a political leader whose policies supposedly began 10 years prior, yet other records suggest the office was vacant. Another cites a scientific breakthrough decades earlier than recognized in textbooks. The conversation hums with casual disbelief, laughter, and speculation. Even contemporary society is built atop uncertainty. A newspaper lies on a table. The headline screams, "Centennial Celebration! City marks 100 years!" You glance at the photographs. Streets, people, and landmarks appear anachronistic. You realize the celebration itself might be an elaborate narrative, a patchwork of truth and assumed continuity. History is being performed, commemorated, and curated, even as gaps persist beneath the surface. You walk into a government archive. Boxes of records line the walls. A clerk flips through files. Births, deaths, tax records, infrastructure reports. Some pages are missing, others are water damaged or redacted. In a margin note, someone has scrawled, "Cannot reconcile dates. Proceed as best guess." You shiver slightly. Even official records, our supposed pillars of certainty, are vulnerable to error, loss, and manipulation. In a quiet park, you watch children play. Their toys are designed decades earlier than official timelines claim, or drawn from forgotten industrial processes. Parents reminisce about events that don't fully align with surviving media reports. Even memory, collective and personal, becomes a questionable source. You realize that the last 100 years, just like the phantom centuries of the distant past, may not be as linear or complete as we assume. Humor sneaks in, dark and subtle. A street performer juggles calendars, tossing them into the air as if mocking the very notion of measured time. Passers-by clap, unaware that some of the dates are historically impossible. You chuckle quietly. The absurdity of human attempts to pin down time has not changed, even in our supposedly modern era. You wander into a laboratory. Scientists examine artifacts, photographs, and documents. One raises an eyebrow at a carbon-dated object. The results contradict known timelines. Another compares digital records with physical evidence, shaking their head. The tension is palpable. Modern tools can expose inconsistencies, yet society is too invested in narrative continuity to acknowledge them fully. Night falls. The city glows with artificial light, yet shadows linger. Ghosts of missing decades whisper in empty alleys and abandoned buildings. You pause atop a bridge, looking down at the river flowing beneath. Constant, indifferent, witness to events that may or may not have occurred exactly as recorded. The water, like time itself, carries fragments of the past, occasionally revealing anomalies that hint at lost, altered, or phantom centuries. You close your eyes, imagining a world where the last 100 years might not have existed entirely as remembered. Leaders, inventions, social movements, and daily life, all filtered through human error, selective preservation, and occasional mischief. You feel a chill. The past is no longer a safe, verified landscape. It is a patchwork of certainty and speculation, truth and conjecture, presence and absence. Finally, you rest on a bench under the streetlights, gazing at the quiet city. Humankind continues to build, remember, and commemorate, oblivious to the gaps beneath. The last 100 years, like centuries before them, are a puzzle, partially erased, partially constructed, partially imagined. And you understand that history is not only what happened, but also what we believe happened, sometimes with unsettling gaps that challenge the narrative we take for granted. You arrive at a modern research facility, sleek and humming with quiet machinery. The air smells faintly of ozone and plastic, a sterile scent so different from the musty archives of centuries past. Scientists move between computers, 3D scanners, and laboratory benches, examining fragments of civilizations that stubbornly refuse to fit neatly into recorded timelines. Here, in the sterile clarity of modern tools, the gaps of history become glaring, unignorable, and strangely unsettling. A researcher holds a small shard of pottery under a microscope. Its glaze, carbon dated to a certain era, contradicts the established chronology by decades. "We're supposed to have invented this style a century later," they mutter, voice tinged with both awe and frustration. You watch as the shard is rotated, illuminated, scrutinized from every angle. Each microscopic detail screams an inconvenient truth. History is broken, and modern science refuses to ignore it. In the lab, a team compares artifacts from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. One piece suggests a trade route existed long before documented evidence. Another shows technological sophistication in regions supposedly isolated at the time. Researchers cross-reference radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, and satellite imagery. The results are simultaneously thrilling and troubling. Civilizations are older, younger, or more advanced than we were taught, and the inconsistencies are everywhere. You follow a historian examining digital reconstructions of ancient cities. Streets appear suddenly, buildings rise in ways inconsistent with known development, and infrastructure is more sophisticated than record suggests. If these timelines are correct, the historian whispers, then someone, somewhere, misremembered, or someone intentionally altered the record. The hum of machines underscores the gravity. Modern science has become a detective, piecing together clues ignored, forgotten, or erased. Outside, archaeological sites continue to reveal anomalies. Foundations appear older than texts indicate, inscriptions conflict with established rulers, and tools predate the inventions they supposedly inspired. You walk through a trench, observing careful measurement and documentation. Every layer of soil is examined meticulously. Even a small misalignment can rewrite centuries. The Earth, as always, resists neat narratives. Humor creeps in amidst the meticulous work. A technician mutters, "Great, another civilization older than we thought. Guess we need to add a millennium to the textbooks again." Laughter ripples across the lab, tension easing briefly. Yet the absurdity of humanity's insistence on chronological neatness is evident. Despite centuries of effort, the past refuses to conform, leaving modern researchers perpetually off balance. You step into a data analysis room, walls lined with screens showing timelines, artifact maps, and comparative studies. One map displays inconsistencies in carbon-dated sites across continents. Another shows overlapping technological milestones, inventions appearing centuries early or late. A scientist traces lines connecting anomalies. "We inherited someone else's mistakes," they sigh, "and maybe a few intentional ones, too." The truth is inescapable. Broken timelines are inherited, stitched together imperfectly, and constantly challenged by new evidence. In a quiet office, a scholar examines historical texts alongside physical evidence. Notes scatter the desk, marginalia pointing out contradictions, footnotes questioning dates, annotations cross-referencing faraway sites. Each piece is a thread in a tangled web of temporal uncertainty. One note reads, "Artifact conflicts with written record. Adjust narrative cautiously." You realize that even in the modern age, the tension between documented history and physical evidence persists. You wander through a room filled with 3D printed replicas of ancient artifacts. Each is modeled for study, yet each carries the same inconvenient truth: dates and origins that refuse to align with accepted timelines. Coins predate empires, pottery styles leap decades, and inscriptions hint at rulers or events never mentioned elsewhere. The sheer volume of evidence begins to feel overwhelming, chaotic, almost comedic in its persistence. Every discovery is a challenge to authority, a nudge against complacency. Outside, satellites track patterns of ancient settlement, rivers, and trade routes. Technology allows historians to see anomalies invisible from the ground. Cities appear suddenly, networks form abruptly, and populations shift with no recorded cause. A glimmer of frustration and wonder passes over you. Despite our tools, we are still interpreting fragments, chasing a past that refuses to be tidy. Humor resurfaces when a team debates a particularly baffling find, a civilization that seems impossibly advanced for its supposed era. Maybe they had alien help, one quips. Laughter erupts, brief relief from the weight of centuries of confusion. Yet beneath the joke lies a profound truth. History is messy, unpredictable, and often defies expectation. As night falls over the research facility, you gaze at the city lights below, aware of the world outside these labs, archives, and dig sites. Historians and scientists work tirelessly to reconcile anomalies, yet every new discovery has the potential to rewrite established narratives. We inherit not only the achievements of the past, but also its errors, omissions, and mysteries. Finally, in the quiet hum of the lab, you reflect on the paradox. The past is tangible in artifacts, structures, and data, yet fluid in interpretation. Broken timelines challenge our sense of continuity, revealing gaps, jumps, and phantom centuries that question everything we think we know. You understand now that modern civilization carries forward not a perfect record, but a patchwork quilt of evidence and imagination stitched together across millennia. And as you leave the facility, stepping into the cool night air, one thought lingers. We may know more than ever, yet the past remains elusive. Every artifact, every anomaly, every unexplained leap reminds us that history is alive, incomplete, and perpetually contested. You sit quietly in a dim room, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the scattered pages before you. The air is heavy with the scent of aged parchment, damp ink, and faint traces of dust. Here, in the stillness, you are left to contemplate the consequences of missing centuries, lost civilizations, and fragmented records. The past is not merely a collection of events. It is the sum of human stories, triumphs, failures, and lives that may never fully remembered. You imagine a village long vanished, its streets alive with the laughter of children, the clatter of markets, the quiet prayers of monks. Fire, flood, plague, and war erased these moments, leaving only scattered fragments, a scorched ledger, a half-burned manuscript, a fragment of pottery. The people who lived here, farmers, artisans, scholars, exist now only in hints and whispers. Their stories, aspirations, and struggles are gone, like echoes swallowed by time. In a museum hall, you observe exhibits representing lost knowledge, tools, weapons, manuscripts, and maps. Each object is a survivor of calamity, an artifact that defied destruction. But for every artifact that endures, countless others have vanished. We inherit a past that is incomplete, shaped as much by chance and accident as by human preservation. You notice a display of medieval instruments, some carefully reconstructed, others mere shadows of what might have existed. The gaps are palpable. History is haunted by what did not survive. You step into a library, shelves lined with carefully preserved texts. Among them, some volumes are intact. Others are missing pages, illegible from fire or water damage. The effort to reconstruct knowledge feels heroic, yet inadequate. You imagine the scholars who once labored tirelessly, copying texts, debating chronology, and recording events, only to have their work consumed by flames or decay. What might have been learned, invented, or understood is lost forever. You wander through an archaeological dig. Fragments of walls, broken pottery, and collapsed infrastructure tell stories only partially. A shard hints at a technology decades ahead of its supposed time. A ruined altar suggests rituals unknown to modern scholarship. Each discovery sparks awe and frustration. We see traces of civilizations, yet the full picture remains just out of reach. Humor surfaces, faint and sardonic. A tiny mouse scurries across a partially excavated manuscript, nibbling a corner. You smile at the absurdity. Even the smallest creatures contribute to the erasure of history. The past is fragile, easily altered by both human and non-human hands. You visit a monastery, once vibrant, now quiet and empty. Scrolls that survived are carefully cataloged. Those lost are remembered only in marginal notes or oral tradition. Fires, floods, human error, and deliberate purges erased knowledge here. Yet the fragments left behind are precious. You realize that every surviving record carries the weight of centuries of survival against odds, an almost miraculous preservation amid chaos. You step outside, walking under a canopy of trees. Sunlight filters through leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. You think of the civilizations erased, the empires rewritten, the knowledge accidentally destroyed, and you wonder, what would we know today if these centuries had survived intact? How would science, art, culture, or philosophy have evolved differently? What songs, stories, and inventions have we never known? In a quiet courtyard, you see students learning, historians working, and scientists experimenting. Each generation builds upon what remains, striving to reconstruct, interpret, and understand. Yet the holes in history persist, shaping the narratives, the assumptions, and even the questions we ask. Missing centuries are not just absences, they are shaping forces, invisible yet powerful. You imagine the people of vanished times, scribes meticulously recording events, artisans crafting wonders, families living day to day. Their lives mattered, their contributions real, yet largely invisible now. The tragedy is not only in the lost knowledge, but in the human experience erased. History, in its gaps, is a record of absence as much as presence. Humor, dark and gentle, whispers again. A scholar debates whether a misdated battle actually occurred, gesturing wildly at a map. Perhaps it was fought by ghosts, he quips. You chuckle quietly, aware that much of the past we reconstruct is indeed spectral. Ghosts of events, people, and civilizations, leaving traces but no certainty. Finally, as evening descends and candlelight flickers across the room, you sit back and reflect. History is not a straight line, a neatly bound book, or a fully documented narrative. It is a patchwork quilt with missing squares, stitched from fragments of human endeavor, accident, and survival. And the gaps, the erased centuries, the lost civilizations, the accidental destruction of knowledge, matter because they remind us that our understanding of the past is limited, humble, and provisional. You close your eyes and let the weight of the centuries settle. The missing stories, the vanished peoples, and the lost wisdom echo silently in your mind. They are reminders that history is fragile, human, and unfinished, that every artifact, manuscript, and story preserved is a triumph over time itself. And in the quiet, you ask yourself, as the narrator once did, what have we truly inherited? How much was lost to fire, flood, neglect, or ambition? And how does it shape the world we live in today? History is alive in its fragments, and in the gaps, it whispers its greatest lessons. We do not merely study the past, we inhabit it, reconstruct it, mourn what was lost, and celebrate what remains. You find yourself back in a quiet room, dimly lit by a single lamp. The scent of parchment, ink, and lingering candle smoke is comforting now, familiar. Outside, the night presses in, soft and still, as if the world itself pauses to listen. Here, in this space between history and imagination, you feel the weight of the stories you've traversed, the centuries missing, the civilizations lost, the human lives forgotten. It is a quiet, reflective moment, a pause to consider not just what history tells us, but what it does not. You pick up a manuscript, worn and fragile. Its edges are frayed, some pages are missing, others smudged. As you turn each page, you are aware of the hands that once held it, the scribes who copied it meticulously, the monks and scholars who curated and sometimes destroyed its contents. You imagine the centuries that passed while this manuscript survived, some accidental, some intentional, all shaping what we now hold as history. Each artifact is a whisper from the past, a survivor of chance, human care, and neglect. Outside, the wind rustles through trees. It carries echoes of markets, chants, battles, and festivals long vanished. You realize that history is not a straight line, not a tidy story, but a patchwork quilt with missing squares, stitched together from fragments that survived fire, flood, war, and human error. The silence between what is recorded and what is lost is as important as the text itself. In those gaps, imagination and inquiry find space to breathe. A cat brushes against your leg, soft and insistent, a small reminder that life continues while history sleeps in fragments. You smile quietly, aware of the continuity of human experience, even when the records fail us. Humor lingers, gentle and sardonic, a single animal, a spilled ink pot, a forgotten ledger, all shaping the narrative we inherit. You close the manuscript slowly. The room feels heavier and lighter at once, filled with absence and presence simultaneously. You think of the people, cities, technologies, and knowledge that have vanished, intentionally erased, lost by accident, or destroyed by time. And you think of the historians, archaeologists, and curious minds who continue to reconstruct, interpret, and imagine. We inherit their efforts, along with the gaps, the mysteries, and the unanswered questions. The night stretches long and quiet. The candle flickers, casting dancing shadows across the walls. You reflect on the journey you've taken through time, through erased centuries, phantom events, forgotten innovations, and the fragile persistence of memory. Every moment you've witnessed has reminded you that history is alive, dynamic, and incomplete. It is stitched together from what remains and what we can infer, but its gaps echo as loudly as its texts. You lean back, closing your eyes for a moment. The questions linger. What was truly lost? How does the absence of knowledge shape our present? Which voices, stories, and civilizations have vanished without a trace? And then, softly, you hear the echo of the narrator's voice from earlier. History isn't a straight line. It's a patchwork quilt with missing squares, and we're still trying to fill them in. You smile at the thought. There is comfort in the pursuit, in the attempt to understand. Even as centuries vanish, even as records fail, the human impulse to seek, to discover, and to remember persists. It is a fragile, resilient, and profoundly human act. To study history is to embrace both its presence and its absence, its certainty and its mystery. The lamp flickers one final time. You close the book, if it's still there, and the room is silent, except for the faint rustle of pages and the distant whisper of time itself. The night stretches on, quiet, reflective, and infinite, carrying with it the echoes of all that was lost, all that was preserved, and all that we have yet to discover. And as you step into the darkness, one thought remains, lingering like a shadow. The past is never truly gone. It waits, in fragments, in whispers, in the quiet spaces between events, for those willing to seek it, question it, and imagine what once was.